Think of the Confederacy, and your focus probably shifts to the U.S. South. Yet during the Civil War era, the Canadian border emerged as an important political and military battleground. On one hand, enslaved people went to great lengths to forge freedom in Canada. Confederates, however, also executed violent attacks on the Union home front from Canada. As a border state, Kentucky played a crucial role in these excursions between North and South. Join us today for a discussion of how Confederate Kentuckians exploited the Canadian border during the Civil War, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. I'm Alan Fletcher, the host of Kentucky Chronicles, a podcast of the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, a scholarly journal in publication since 1903. I also coordinate our Research Fellows program. Kentucky Chronicles is a podcast that shares diverse histories from the Commonwealth and beyond. It is inspired by the works of researchers from across the world who have explored our rich archival holdings at the Kentucky Historical Society. Before we get to our interview with Dr. Werking, I'd like to give a shout out to another Kentucky history podcast. I recently had the chance to sit down for a brief chat with Clay Wallace of Capital City Museum here in Frankfort. I'm pleased today to be joined by Clay Wallace, who is with Capital City Museum here in Frankfort and the host of Any Old Place podcast. So it's always great to have guests on to talk shop about the podcast world, and we're really excited to feature your all's podcast and learn more about it. So could you just tell us a little bit about the podcast, how it got started, and some of the content you've been focusing on?
Absolutely, for sure, Alan. So I am the podcast producer for the Capital City Museum. We have 3 podcasts, and I am the host of Any Old Place, which is a podcast that looks at Frankfort history from specific locations. One of the episodes that I think is really fun is the episode on the Paul Sawyer Public Library building, which also previously was the old post office and also the old federal courthouse. But before it was any of those things, it was the ferry crossing over from North Frankfort to South Frankfort. And it was also a sawmill, because at the time, Frankfort was a major producer of riverboats, which were used in trade all the way down the Mississippi and out to England and back. And so to be able to talk to people familiar with the history and then talk to people who were actively serving in the judiciary when it was a federal courthouse, that I had the opportunity to speak with someone who was there when it was the post office, and I had the opportunity to speak with someone who was there when it was the library in the early years. So that's exciting to get to see. And then I also produce, the museum director, Dr. Eleanor Haskin-Wagner, has her podcast, Kentucky Deceased, which is a limited series Halloween October podcast. We release 5 episodes every October. Sometimes it's an interview podcast where Ellie will bring people on and discuss things that they've been involved in. There have been murder mysteries. There have been ghost stories. One episode, she digs into the Project Blue Book alien sightings in Franklin County. So it kind of leans into kind of the spooky, ethereal. And then there's also found footage that we have there. So in Kentucky Deceased, there is an episode where we look at somebody's 1960 senior project at UK where they redid War of the Worlds as if it was a broadcast out of Lexington. So the epicenter of the alien invasion was Lexington. We also have an episode where the old Frankfort radio station, back in the 70s during the Satanic Panic, they actually facilitated a live interview between a satanic priest out of Louisville and a Christian seminary professor at the seminary up in Cincinnati. So there's all sorts of these interesting things. It's kind of a grab bag of neat stories. And then the third podcast that I produce is Reflections with Patty Peevler, and that is a vignette style podcast where she tells stories from her book. She's written one book about early Kentucky history at the bend of the river, and then she's also written a book on Leestown history. And so she tells those stories to you as, someone who has spent their whole life in Frankfort. And it's interesting to get her perspective on things and also the research that she's been able to do at the Capital City Museum.
A couple of the podcasts that you host and produce have also won some of our Kentucky History Awards here at KHS.
Yes,
right?
I'm very grateful. Any Old Place, the podcast which I host and produce, won the 2024 Kentucky History Award. And then the podcast which Patty Peevler hosts and I produce, Reflections, won the 2025 Kentucky History Day Awards.
Excellent. So they've got a good track record and are clearly doing great work. I think it's great that you're doing not only themed episodes, which I find really interesting, but also really putting the spotlight on local history, which is often overlooked, and they're stories that can be easily lost. So I really enjoy and appreciate that you're focusing on these local stories. What value do you see in telling a lot of these local stories?
Frankfort is a really interesting town. I kind of come from the bias that all towns are very interesting, but I've lived in Frankfort my whole life. My family has been here in Frankfort since the 70s. And what's interesting about Frankfort is that so much of Kentucky's history is wrapped up in Frankfort's history. And it's interesting to be able to trace these little stories that feed into this larger story. And the other thing that makes Frankfort so interesting, as it is the capital, is that you meet someone in Frankfort, and half the time they're not from Frankfort, and they bring all of their interesting stories, all their interesting perspectives with them when they come here. And it's exciting to get to see like a microscope on early state history and on what the state looks like now due to the influence of people that come here for whatever reason they come here.
Mm-hmm. And these three podcasts that you mentioned, I assume they're available on most major streaming platforms?
They are. You can find any of the Capital City Museum's podcasts on any major streaming platform. They are on Spotify. They are on Apple Podcasts. They're easy to find.
Well, I really encourage our listeners to go over to Capital City's website and listen to some of Clay and his colleagues' podcasts. They've got great content about Frankfort, but also, as you mentioned, about Kentucky and even national history, using these local stories to tell broader stories. So thank you so much for coming and chatting with me today.
Thank you.
Our guest today is Dr. Cassandra Jane Werking, a December 2024 Research Fellow at the Kentucky Historical Society. Dr. Werking is from East Greenbush, New York, and graduated with a PhD in History from the University of Kentucky in May 2025. Her dissertation is titled Refuge, Raids, and Confederates on Sleighs: How the Confederacy Exploited Canada and the International Border and Shaped the American Civil War. Werking now plans to publish her dissertation as a book and pursue her dream of becoming a history professor. When Werking is not researching the military, political, and social history of the American Civil War and the long 19th century, she can be found enjoying Dunkin iced coffee and going on road trips to the Adirondack Mountains. I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Cassie Jane Werking, who is here to talk about her recent research fellowship here at KHS. And I always enjoy talking with researchers about the origin stories of their projects. Mm-hmm. So what led you to focus on the Civil War and Canada for your dissertation?
Well, I first of all want to say that I'm very excited to be here. I'm so appreciative of my KHS fellowship that helped me complete my dissertation, and excited to build on that moving forward. So I am from upstate New York, and I loved my undergraduate history professors at Siena College, and I took a military history class that was definitely out of my wheelhouse. We took a trip to Gettysburg, and I fell in love with history, specifically learning about historical actors at Gettysburg and beyond their identification as a soldier, what they were. And from there, I heard my professor talk about these Confederates who had been in Vermont. And he didn't really expand upon that, but it's something that has stuck with me. And when I entered the graduate program at UK in 2016, I was thinking, I'm really curious about this, if there was disloyalty near the border from upstate New York, where I was from. So I wanted to dig into that. And what I had uncovered is that there wasn't just disloyalty, but that there was a Canada mission that was advanced by the Confederacy to try to make military progress where they couldn't on established battlefields and established theaters of war, that this mission was much more protracted. It started at the beginning of the war of 1861. It lasted until the end, and it was trying to expand the boundaries of warfare across the international border, and not just raids, but also trying to release Confederate prisoners that were in Union prisons. And I just kept uncovering more and more that I wanted to look into that for my dissertation, and I am very happy that I did. I just am finding more and more to add to that.
And it's so interesting because so much of the scholarship on the Civil War, especially from a Kentucky perspective, a Confederate perspective, looks south. But you're looking north, and not just to Ohio or Indiana, but you're looking to Canada. How does looking north from a Confederate perspective change how we've thought about the Civil War?
What's really interesting is that it's further showing us that this wasn't simply a war between the North and the South, and that further complicating it and making even all the more interesting on how we conceptualize boundaries of war and how people challenge that. And since the beginning of the war, even before the Confederacy legitimized this Confederate Canadian operation, that people were already trying to avoid imprisonment by American authorities for being disloyal, for being treasonous, and many of them went to Canada for that reason. And so there's growing Confederate presence in Canada since the beginning of the war, gave the Confederacy this understanding that this could be an area of opportunity. So Kentuckians, Confederate Kentuckians, and their families and their wives, which is another element that comes out in my dissertation and that I want to expand on further, is that they were already finding and making space for themselves in Canada. And when that growing presence became more attractive for the Confederacy to legitimize it and make a military operation there, is what you have this official turn in 1864 after you have some more large scale Confederate breaking out of prison and finding their way to Canada. Kentuckians were already finding purpose in Canada prior to the Confederacy finding purpose there. So they convinced the Confederacy that there was an area of opportunity there by fleeing there to avoid imprisonment for their disloyalty.
Interesting. So a more practical question, how does one get to Canada, right? I mean, what does the actual process look like? What are the challenges of escaping to Canada, and what do they do once they get there?
Yeah, well, see, that's a very interesting question. And one of the people that I studied here at KHS, Henry Lane Stone, who was fighting with John Hunt Morgan, his cavalry regiments, Confederate General John Hunt Morgan, and he escapes from being imprisoned by the Union Army. And it's like this odyssey of trying to find sympathizers and supporters who would give him shelter, give him food. And he outlines that in his diary, in his writings home, and that there were people who helped him get to the border. It seems like he is a combination of walking there or taking a train or taking a boat or sometimes all of the above, maybe not necessarily with him, but with other people who found their way there. And once they got there, they struggled to, what do I do in the meantime before I try to get back to the Confederacy, before I try to run the blockade back to the regiment or another regiment to advance the Confederacy? So for him, he actually helped with harvesting maple. So he was helping learn how to tap trees in Canada, what they would call sugar bushes, and he became part of the maple business, which is really interesting to think about. He also had a plan to find tobacco and roll cigars. That didn't seem to pan out, but he had a long-term plan depending on how long he was in Canada. Sometimes he would talk very favorably about his experience there, how he could be free to talk about how much he hated the United States and how disloyal he was, and buying his time until he could get back. Then other moments he talked about how being in exile away from his family and away from his friends was very disconcerting and hard to sit with. But he ultimately does leave Canada. But he not before taking up skating as well. So it's interesting that that him as one example of a Confederate who is finding even times of recreation in Canada and socializing with other Confederate Kentuckians. You could see this social geography, this map of other families and other people he knows. He's even living with a roommate who's another soldier from one of Morgan's regiments. And he actually had a group of people who served under Morgan that they all went to church together. So he's finding, it's very clear that he is finding a community within Canada of other Confederate Kentuckians, some of which he was either from the same hometown or that he served with under Morgan. So you see these social connections that are being planted in Canada and grown, that maybe makes it more like home than you would think because of other Kentuckians who were there.
Interesting. He's trading tobacco for maple and maybe horse racing for skating.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
But you use the word free, that he's trying to find his freedom in Canada. And I think there's an interesting flip side too, because white Confederates aren't the only ones who are going to Canada. We know all about enslaved peoples, refugees going to Canada through the Underground Railroad. So are Confederates interacting with enslaved refugees? Are they running into each other? How does that look up there?
Yes, that's actually a really interesting social dynamic that has not been examined and that I examine in my dissertation briefly, but where I want to expand my project, because I've always thought that these two parallel paths, that more so with the passing of the 1858 Fugitive Slave Law, but even prior to then, that enslaved people who forged their freedom would go to Canada in some of the same spots in Canada that during the Civil War, enslavers like Henry Lane Stone would also find meaning from that same place, extracting meaning for these two diametrically opposed groups from Canada. And their interactions in one breath, they will talk about how in Canada they can be free, in quotes, to be disloyal and treasonous to the United States without fearing imprisonment. Yet they'll also talk about how they're walking down the street and they see black men and women who are everyday life doing similar things in proximity and interacting in ways that they are not okay with, that they don't like. In a different collection that I looked at the Filson Historical Society, you have a man named Joy is the last name. I'm forgetting what his first name is, but the Joy's family in Canada for same reasons, avoiding imprisonment, and he's seeing white and black people dancing together, and he is very disturbed by that, but he's also thankful for Canada, where he can be free and treasonous to the United States, but he's remarking on this social dynamic that goes against everything of why he's fighting for the Confederacy, to preserve slavery, to preserve white supremacy. So there's that dynamic that I try in the certain moments that I extract from the materials that I looked at for my dissertation, but I know there's more out there, and that's where I want to take the next step of this project, because, I mean, it's so fascinating to think how these two groups, diametrically opposed, both finding meaning in Canada, both leveraging the border for their benefit to advance their very different causes, freedom, enslavement, and yet there's these moments where they're in the same towns, maybe in the same hotels, maybe in the same restaurants, that they're interacting in ways that are challenging, why they're there in the first place. So that is something I want to look more into, and I think is an area where Civil War scholarship hasn't looked at before.
Interesting. And you do such a good job in your dissertation, but also right now talking about this. I haven't read your dissertation, but I did read your research report, and it gave us so many of these great social histories of people going to Canada, as you mentioned, interacting with each other in ways that just wasn't happening, especially in places like Kentucky or parts of the Deep South. But you're also interested in how fleeing to Canada, whether it's well, mostly Confederates, how that's reshaping Confederate wartime strategy.
Yes.
And you talk about John Hunt Morgan. A lot of listeners are probably familiar with John Hunt Morgan's raid through Kentucky, but you're interested in how his raid and subsequent people who are fleeing to Canada are changing Confederate military strategy, especially after 1863 when war fortunes start to go south for the Confederacy.
Yes.
So how is all of this changing how the Confederacy fights the war after 63?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is this pivotal moment when, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but with John Hunt Morgan, we know how he terrorized Kentucky. He wanted to be firmly for the Confederacy. And we know that Kentucky never seceded from the United States. So the real fear that Kentuckians felt with his actions and the actions of his men in Kentucky, the fear was felt on a larger scale when he took his raids further north. He was in prison in the Ohio Penitentiary with many of his men, including someone named Thomas Henry Hines, and I'll explain where the significance of him comes in. But they're in prison in the Ohio Penitentiary, and they're trying to get back to fighting for the Confederacy, and it's this moment where they break out of the prison. They tunnel themselves out under the kind of the head leader of that, who was Thomas Henry Hines. They tunnel themselves out. They're on the move. And in this, again, Odyssey is kind of this interesting word to describe these journeys of how they found their way back to the Confederacy, or they found their way to Canada, or a mix of all the above. They're on the run, and they're thinking about what they could do to help the Confederacy. And this is the fall of 1863, leading up until January of 1864. And on this journey, the two of them, it wasn't linear. Thomas Henry Hines gets re-imprisoned, has to re-break out along the way. Somehow they reunite, and when they get to Richmond, Virginia, they talk to Jefferson Davis about being able to have these prison breaks on a larger scale. And how to do that would be to use Canada and disloyal pockets of people and military organizations in the Northwest, in Kentucky, in Indiana, in Ohio, near Chicago, and how certain Union prisons that were in that area, including Johnson's Island, which is the main prison that's mentioned, it's in the middle of Lake Erie, that how could we break out these Confederate prisoners that have experience, that have leadership, and get them back to the battlefield in established theaters of war. So being able to get that concentration of people who they know are experienced, military experience, many of them are officers. Some of those prisons, like Johnson's Island, are specifically for officers, so that's people with leadership experience, get them back to the Confederacy. And it's in this moment, and this is this moment that emerges from my research that I'm putting particular attention to, because that's when there's this legitimizing, from the Confederacy's perspective, this legitimizing of using the border of Canada to their benefit, to whether causing a Northwest uprising, or creating a Northwest Confederacy, or using that to have more large-scale prison breaks, attacking the United States home front areas that weren't part of these established theaters of war, that was an area of significant opportunity. And that's the beginning of 1864 that happened. So from 1864 forward, the Confederacy is funneling resources and people to these areas of the United States home front to disrupt, to harm, to cause fear in ways that those communities were not used to, along Lake Erie, along other Great Lakes, specifically, even upstate New York, where I'm from, which is really interesting to think about. So it's this concerted effort after this point that you see these challenging of what was the accepted boundaries of warfare. And it's very insidious. It is looking at public forms of transportation that were hijacked by these Confederates for these purposes, like hijacking a steamboat or trying to derail a train, things that you might not think of in ways that warfare was affecting civilians who were caught in the crosshairs. I know it's a long answer to your question,
no,
but I could keep going on and on. That's a big question.
But it is a big question. But presumably they had help too, and it's not just Confederate military officials or the Confederate government. I was really struck in your report, in your discussion of Patty Burnley, who lived right here in Frankfort. She was a Confederate sympathizer, and she is playing a crucial role in this process. So I wonder if you could talk a little about how ordinary people like Patty Burnley are helping with this Confederate strategy. And as you note, it also reveals some really important gendered insights too.
Yes, absolutely. And Patty Burnley's story and her papers were especially fascinating because it shows, which is building on the trend in the scholarship and the historiography that show that women were involved and affected by war and made war themselves for both the United States and for the Confederacy. And what's interesting about the opportunities that Kentucky presented for people like Patty Burnley is that Confederate prisoners of war in Union prisons could not correspond with family members who were in Confederate states. So Kentucky was a way that you could correspond with somebody who could help you or who could connect for your family in these Confederate states, because Kentucky never seceded from the United States. So Patty Burnley, being in Frankfort, she was, I believe, around 30 years old at the time of the war. Interestingly enough, you fast forward after the war, she actually helped the Register for the Kentucky Historical Society and wrote pieces, at least one piece for the Register. So that's an interesting post-war of her involvement. But Patty Burnley, she wrote to a diverse range of Confederate soldiers, like Rock Island Prison in Chicago, Johnson's Island in Lake Erie, Sandusky, Ohio, various prisons, Fort Delaware. Not only was she providing clothing, she was providing money, she was connecting them to other people that she knew or helping them find information about their family members or people who could help. There were legal, some of the Kentuckians who needed like legal assistance or legal funding, she would help with that based on, even though the letters are from the perspective of the prisoners and not her, you can get a sense of her significance and importance based on what the prisoners are saying, that people wanted to get connected to her. She was connected to John Hunt Morgan and his men, but were connected to people who seem that could help them in some way, whether it was financial, whether it was giving them information. This circulation of information between prisons is also clear in her correspondence. You can see how even if you weren't imprisoned with your men at the same location, that you could find information about them. You could find information about how the war was going. You can figure that out and trace that through her letters. And Patty Burnley's story, although her collection only has 31 letters, it brought me yet again another example that wartime experiences for men or women, for civilians and soldiers, there was never one size fits all of what their experience of war was like. And for her, in a unique positioning in Frankfort, in Kentucky, being able to correspond with these Confederate prisoners in other Union prisons elsewhere, she was a focal point for many of them and helped them. And I would love to learn more about her and expanding my understanding of what did she do in other years during the war, what did she do after the war. I would love to know that. But she seems to have been involved with the Kentucky Historical Society for some period.
Sounds like it would make for a great Register article.
I know, it does. I'm excited. I've got to look more into Patty Burnley.
Doing
But she
some
seems
potential
fascinating.
recruiting on the air here.
And I am excited to be recruited.
So let's go back up to Canada a little bit. I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, but as you know, all of this is interconnected in some way or the other. So if a Confederate refugee gets to Canada, whether it's through the help of Patty Burnley or other grassroots networks, I'm not sure if that's how I should describe them, but these transportation networks that are getting people to Canada, are they planning on staying there long term? You mentioned that Heinz was starting a maple business and things like that. Are they imagining a long-term future up there? Or I would imagine it would depend upon how the war goes too. But do we see some people settling there long term?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's actually, so just to clarify, the Stone, Henry Lane Stone was the one that was
Stone, I'm
involved,
sorry.
sure. But Thomas Henry Hines, who's one of the main, what I would call the main leaders of the military arm of the Confederate operation, along with John Breckinridge Castleman, who's another main player, he is not putting aside other life milestones during this time of being a part of the Confederate Canada operation, because he's actually marrying his wife and crossing the border multiple times, including with her during the war. So one of the things I look at is how these wives and families are pulled into the international dimension of the war at the border. So that's a whole nother interesting aspect of Thomas Henry Hines. But from what I can tell in the research I've done so far is that it wasn't a long-term desire to stay in Canada, but a life in exile where they could still stay just as committed to the Confederacy during the war and into Reconstruction until it became easier to come back into the United States after the war under President Andrew Johnson's leadership, that they ultimately would come back, that they would make lives for themselves in the meantime. Their children even went to Canadian schools, including the Davis's children. Even Jefferson Davis went to Canada after he was released from prison in 1867 for a period of time. But they ultimately would come back, is what it seems to be the trend that I can take away at this point in time in my research.
Gotcha. And I imagine it can be difficult to trace a lot of these stories too, which I think leads pretty well to the next question, and one of our last questions, which has to do with source material. I always love talking shop about the kinds of sources that researchers are using. So what have been some of the most valuable sources to you, and what have been some of the challenges of trying to uncover some of these stories?
The most important sources that I looked at, and one of them being the official records of the War of the Rebellion. But in addition to that, to give it more breadth, to make it a more well fleshed out overall picture of what was going on, is the family papers, the collections of family papers, to understand not only, so I'd start off with a point person, one of these Confederate soldiers, and then by looking at their family papers, I would see so much more of their social orbit. I would see their wives, or their soon-to-be wives. Even John Hunt Morgan's second wife, he got married during the war, Martha Reddy Morgan, otherwise known as Maddie. She also comes up in my dissertation because I give more full breadth to these characters and that social orbit that I referenced, to show these connections of what they were connected to while they were trying to fight for the Confederacy, and that these people also helped in turn to fight for the Confederacy. These family papers, and looking at the perspective of the women in their lives, their daughters and their children and their wives, that they were involved in being a part of this moment. Mm-hmm. And those family papers have been so underutilized in discussion, of Civil War scholarship, writ large, but specifically in these Confederate leaders, that looking at their families and their children and what their lives looked like and how they were connected to this is so important. And I've leaned into those family papers. I've leaned into those family papers here at the KHS, at the University of Kentucky Special Collections, and at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville. And that has been such a rich way to make them beyond just one-dimensional, these characters, and to add so many more voices. How I approach this dissertation is to add as many more voices of historical actors as possible to the story. And those family papers have helped me do that. And I am excited to not only put the voices of these women and daughters, some of them even copying the letters for their father from Canada, which is really interesting. Not only do you have that, but I want to put that in the same examination as the voices of enslaved men and women before the war, because there are these moments of intersections and these parallel paths there, and putting them in conversation with each other is a way that I can add to the scholarship that has been under-examined up until this point, and I think will help us understand how this dynamic between enslaver and enslaved, and the resistance of the enslaved, how it would take yet a different form when they are interacting with each other across the border, and how that would challenge the enslavers' view of this time that they're in Canada and what they're making out of it, and also seeing how enslaved people are making lives for themselves as freed people. And that's really, I think it's an exciting opportunity for me as a scholar, and specifically from Kentucky. I wasn't, because I went to school at UK and I love UK, go Cats, but I wasn't trying necessarily to find a Kentucky connection. That emerged from the research, that a very strong Kentucky connection with this. And I think it's because since there were enslavers who wanted to support the Confederacy, wanted to fight for the Confederacy, they forced a thread for Kentucky into the Confederacy and from Kentucky to Canada. And that is what I am trying to further flesh out as I expand my dissertation research moving forward.
It sounds like we have a lot to look forward to.
Maybe a future podcast.
In terms of articles, but also a potential book. I understand you'd like to turn this into a book someday.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a good place to wrap this up. We can leave our listeners wanting more and to eagerly await the articles and books that come out of this. So Dr. Werking, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I can't wait to come back and do more research at KHS.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
In the decades after the Civil War, Kentucky developed a strong Confederate identity despite never leaving the Union. As Dr. Werking has explained, looking to Canada reveals intersections between the practices of freedom-making, women's experiences during wartime, and the extent of wartime violence. Canada emerged as a contested space where a range of Kentuckians, from enslaved peoples to white Confederate soldiers, searched for their own definitions of freedom. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is produced by Gregory Hardison with support from Dr. Stephanie Lang. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication of the Register or our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends and colleagues. Thanks to Dr. Werking for appearing on today's episode, and I look forward to welcoming our next guest on Kentucky Chronicles.